Thank you for joining us here today. Today I have the extraordinary Janell Pryor, who is an author, a speaker, and she wears all the hats as a mom. How are you doing today, Janelle?
Hi, I'm doing. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Where did your story begin?
So, um, I guess taking it all the way back, originally in Augsburg, Bavaria, Germany, I was an army brat and was born abroad, um, obviously on U.S. soil. So I lived there till I was about 3, and then came stateside to a small town in Missouri, where I was um, raised and attended school and, all of the generic things. But at about 3 years old, my mom and my dad divorced. And so my mom and my two sisters moved about 5 hours away with my mother. And I stayed with my dad and my grandparents. And that was kind of like where life shifted. And I don't know, it just kind of, I guess, like that broken family theme started playing out.
And that is one, while we are always talking about it, we don't talk about how it is internally and
Right.
how if that is something that causes broken links within you can really haunt you for the rest of your life if you don't deal with it effectively.
Absolutely. And I think it leads into a sowing of, misunderstanding. And I think a lot of us, we can take blame for that because we don't know the full story. We don't know, especially for me, it was at a young age. And so, um, to have a complete understanding of what love was in the first place, and then as a child, I was very happy go lucky. I fall down, I cry, I get up, I eat some food, and move on. And so my thinking at the time, as childlike as it was, kind of revolved around, well, my mom has my sisters, but my dad doesn't have anybody, so I'm going to stay with him. And that was the thought process that went into it. And they actually, my parents did sort of let us choose who we wanted to stay with, which was cool because there wasn't that custody battle and that kind of stressors on us, which I think helped. Um, but at the same time, you know, I guess I kind of always wonder what life would have been like had I made a different decision. And so I didn't know my sister or my mom until I was 18. And at 16, my oldest sister took her life. And so she's no longer with us. And that was something that I had to kind of learn how to traverse that grief because I didn't know her the greatest, but it was still like, but she was my sister. So, and at the same time, it hit my other sister very hard. Um, and so that was a catalyst moment in both of our lives for different things.
I can only imagine. I mean, as a teen, I lost someone that was like a sister. She was murdered. And I get that grief of losing my favorite person in the world. But an actual sister? No, my half sister is a cow. I don't like her. I wouldn't mind. I'm not gonna seek it out, but I wouldn't mind.
I understand. So going back, um, for me at around, 8 years old, um, someone very close to me started assaulting me sexually. And so I didn't have a mom. I didn't have a whole lot of security, and understanding. It wasn't something that like I could bring to family members, things like that. And so I was assaulted from the time I was 8 until I was 18, and I was raped for the first time. And then I had enlisted in the military at 17. And they had this program where with a parent signature, you could enlist. You would do basic training between your junior and senior year, and then between after your senior year, you would go to advanced individual training, which was, you know, for your MOS, whatever your job was going to be. And so I enlisted as a military police officer, went to basic, had to overcome lots of things there. And then I went through AIT. And at this time, I had just enlisted in the National Guard. But after about 3 years, I did what's called a conditional release. And I went into active duty where I got stationed in Hawaii. And everybody's like, oh, you know, the luck, you know, and I'm like, well, you know, to live there for another 3 years is just like, it's great, complete culture shock, but at the same time, you really got to a point of like, I can drive around the island in 2 hours and there's nothing to do on this pebble. And so, while it was a great experience, there was also a lot of trauma there.
Mhm.
So I was dating a guy, and in order for us to stay together and not have a long distance relationship, in order for him to go with me, we went to the justice of the peace and got married. And of course, for the wrong reasons, obviously, it's not going to work out. The whole relationship, year and a half long, was just kind of like it was a mess. I went to work, he played video games, you know, there's one in every crowd. So so we divorced and I moved back into the barracks on base. Um, and that led to kind of some wild living on my part. And ever since I was young, I believe because of the assault that happened, I didn't learn about biologically healthy relationships. And so to seek those out, like for me, it was like, oh, well, I wanted safety, security, and love, which I think is honest. Like, I don't think that's wrong of anybody to want, but I was looking at it for it out of desperation, um, thinking that that was going to fix my problems. And so, one, I didn't know what to look for. Two, I didn't know where to look. And three, my standards were not very good because at that point, when you're at a desperate point, like you're clinging to whatever can get you out of the hole that you're in, whether it's a root or a rock, it doesn't matter. You know, they're all muddy. So, um, I made a lot of mistakes. I was in a lot of bad relationships. Um, there were more assaults that happened. And I know that some people like to be like, oh, well, you put yourself in those positions. No, always means no. Period, exclamation point, end of story. Um, I do believe I could have handled situations better. Um, but at the end of the day, I did not force those people to act on the actions, on the thoughts that they acted on.
Exactly. No does mean no. And
Correct.
that is something that we are super currently forgetting because all no's mean no. You're
Yeah.
beginning the act, you're part way through the act, you're 3/4 of the way through the act, and you get a no, that's a complete stop. That's a
Yep.
stop where you are, go and move on.
Exactly.
Like whether
So,
you're together or not.
right. So, um, I had gone through another assault, and this one was military related. And it really put me in a place because at that point, this was number five. You know, I was in my head, I'm like, if this is all that's ever going to happen to me, I don't want to live like this. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. I don't want to play the game anymore. And so, you know, those thoughts, those suicidal thoughts came into my mind. And it was that, and I know that it was like the devil and the enemy coming and attacking me in my thoughts. But at the same time, I was so vulnerable and influential of the world because I didn't have a firm foundation in my faith. And so I didn't have something strong to lean on. And I don't guess I ever really did. I mean, my grandma had faith, but it was very superficial for me, because I hadn't had any experiences, like real experiences at that point to anchor me in. And so I a friend of mine that was still there, because our unit was on deployment. I'd actually messed up my back and my hip, and so I didn't get to go on this deployment, and was actually in the middle of what's called a med board, or a medical retirement. And so, a friend of mine, he's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No." And so he called my NCO. My NCO calls me and says, "Are you thinking of doing something stupid?" And I'm like, "Yes, yes, I am." Like I could identify that as being stupid, but in my head, it didn't change the fact that I just wanted to make the hurting stop.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the only way I could do it.
Hmm.
And so they put me into, they sent me to Colorado, to a behavioral hospital, and I stayed there for a couple of months, to learn how to cope, which was something that I'd never learned as a child, which I didn't realize at the time, but would become very influential in my future. And so I learned how to cope with trauma and PTSD and pain and all of that stuff, um, a little bit anyway. And
Hmm.
then I was getting prepared, to testify against my assailant, because this time it was going to court. And anybody who has gone through this experience, who's gone through, um, rape, assault, anything, done in that way, I will speak out and say, one, it's very hard to go through the act and the situation and deal with those emotions.
Hmm.
It's very hard to go through a hearing or the justice process to face your assailant in that manner. And then it's also very hard when you go through it and you know exactly what happened. And they say, well, we can't really decide who was at fault here. So we're going to say that he's not guilty. And it was a he said, she said kind of case. And we're just going to put it down in his record, but he's not going to get in trouble for it. And I was crushed when that happened. But at the same time, that was the first time God kind of like spoke to me and reassured me that he couldn't hurt me anymore. I had brought it to the light. People were aware of this thing. And though I was being persecuted, like it was my fault and I was just causing drama, um, I knew the truth, God knew the truth, and it was out there. People were watching. So shortly after that, I got out of the military and went back home. Um, but in the interim of this time frame, I had met my second husband, and our marriage only lasted for 2 weeks. He was a military, intelligence soldier, and they have this thing in the military called a contract marriage. And basically, it's when two soldiers get married, both of their, incomes go up. Lots of people do it. We were already seeing each other. We're like, yeah, why not? We got married. 5 days later, I found out I was pregnant. And I was just like, oh man. So he was 19, I was 22. And he quickly kind of got to the point where he wasn't ready for the responsibility. And because of all of my traumas, I was like, you're either going to be here or you're not, but I'm not waiting. So, like, make up your mind. So, when he wasn't ready to be there, I came back home. And um, so then, of course, looking for the next relationship because I'm still seeking that security, that love, my fairy tale ending. That's what I wanted. Um, I got in another relationship, um, wasn't a good one. got out of that relationship, decided I was like, I'm done for a while. I move in with some girlfriends of mine and my daughter, who's 3 months old at this point. And, I'm like, I have a new purpose for living. She, like, being pregnant really put some things in perspective, and I had to stop living for me in some ways. And I was like, okay. And along comes this guy that I'd gone to school with and had a huge crush on him all through school, but like never expected to see the time of day. And he came and knocked on the door one day and wanted to go hang out. And I was like, yeah, I'll go on a date with you. And I wound up staying the night with him that night. And basically from that point on, we were together. And about 6 months into our relationship, we're already living together at this point and everything. I walk in on him and he's got a needle in his arm. And he tells me it's just water. I just like the prick of the needle, the pain. It just reminds me, blah, blah, blah. And I should have ran, but there was something in me that wouldn't allow me to. And so that started a toxic relationship of abuse physically, drug use on my part as well, because that was the only time I'd get his attention, was if we were on the same level.
Yeah.
And it just, I mean, like it was the worst relationship I've ever been in. And I knew after 4 years that if I stayed in it, I was going to die. There was no way I was going to make it out of that relationship alive. And so that was when I decided that it was time, and I got sober while he was still using, which that in itself was hard.
Yeah.
Um, and I got a job at a gas station, and I remember sitting there one night, and I was just um, heartbroken, and I knew that it was time for me to go, but I had tried to leave so many times, and something always made me come back. I didn't want to do that anymore. I didn't want to go back and forth. Like, I thought that I could save him. I thought that I was strong enough to save him. But when you have two hurt people and you put them in a relationship, they can't save each other or themselves.
Right. It's kind of the ultimate codependency, like
Yes.
Shakespearean trope of this is not healthy, but we will not give up.
Right. Do us part. Well, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
So um at that point, I remember sitting on the couch and he wasn't there. And I just cried out to God and I said, God, I know that it's time for me to leave, but I don't feel strong enough to do this. I said, so if I'm supposed to do this right now, I need you to give me a sign. And at this point, I didn't know, honestly, if I'm being realistic, I didn't expect to hear anything. I didn't expect a sign. It was like that. Um, you play a carnival game and you hope that you're going to win, but like 10 times out of 10 you lose. You're
Yeah.
like, they're made so you don't win. And so I was having the same expectation. And 2 days later I went to work at the gas station, and as I'm working, I had taken a break, a cigarette break, and I went outside, and this old brown Ford truck pulls up to the diesel pump. And it's been broken for a few days, and he comes over and he says, when do you know when it's going to be fixed? And I said, I don't know. We had somebody come out, but we don't know when the part's coming in to fix it. So really, I don't have an answer for you. And he saw one of my tattoos and commented on it. And he's like, where'd you get them? And I said, well, some here and some in Hawaii when I was stationed there. And he like double took and he's like, stationed. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, you were in the military? I was like, yes. And he had been too. And I was like, oh. And this whole time I just kind of been staring at my phone, not really caring or whatever. And at that point I looked up and I saw these giant blue saucers staring at me. And I was like, oh, shoot, like, dang. And so he goes, I'm going to go get a drink at the other gas station because we didn't carry the sarsaparilla that he wanted. And he goes, can I come back and talk to you? And I said, yeah. And so I went back in and was working, and he comes back up and we're just talking and everything. And he asked me if I wanted to go fishing. And I was like, yeah, I don't care about fishing, like, so he goes, now you don't mind dogs, do you? Because I got a dog. And I said, well, you don't mind fire breathing dragons, do you? Because I got a 3-year-old. And so that was kind of like funny. But at that point, I felt the need to explain my situation and let him know I was in a relationship. Um, and honestly, like, this is not something I would have ever done, I guess, on myself, by myself, because like I said, I didn't really care about fishing. I wasn't a cheater. It wasn't my MO. And so I just like word vomited my situation, the drug, the abuse, everything. And he goes, wow, well, it sounds like you need a friend. So that's what I'd like to be. And I was like, cool, thank you. And it was the first time that I really felt like somebody wanted to stay despite all of the crazy, right? And so we were playing 20 questions because I like to think about how people's brains work, right? And I asked him if he had a son, what he would name him, because I'd had my son's name picked out for years. And he paused for a moment and he looked at me and he goes, Tristan. And I was just like, there's no way, because that's my name. There's no way. And at that moment in time, I knew exactly that that was the sign God had sent me, because he, like, nobody else would have known that. It wasn't something I put out there. I didn't tell people this. And so um, that was my sign. And I knew it. And I knew that God had come through on what I'd asked. And so 2 days later, I left that toxic relationship and went, oh my gosh. And so from that moment, I realized that God did care about me. He saw me in my depravity, in my pain and suffering, and he heard my prayer and he cared about little old me who had done so much wrong in my life, that had been so broken and just abused and hurt and torn and just trashed all of my life. And it was the first time I felt truly heard and seen and loved. And I was, wow. And so obviously, the friendship a few weeks later turned into more. And we've now been married for 5 years. We've been together for 9. And our son's name is Tristan, and 3 beautiful children. Um, and so it just, the things that God did in that season, that was,
Well, and exactly. And frankly, we all believe in something. Like we all, whether it's the universe, whether it's the spaghetti monster, we all have something that we turn to when we feel so lost that we don't know what to do and we don't have anyone to talk to. And
right,
that is something, especially in westernized mental health. Oh, you believe God talks to you? You're crazy. No. If you look around, life is always talking to us. Like that
right,
houseplant that you don't water properly. It tells you it's dying all the time.
right. Darker it gets.
But that change, that moment where it shifted for you, is so wholesome that it should be in a movie.
I know, right? Like, I never thought that my fairy tale would happen. Honestly, I don't know that I ever felt like my fairy tale was actually going to come true. And the more that I tried to make it come true, the more it seemed, the further away it was. Um, and so even after I got married and it looked like a fairy tale, it wasn't completely. Um, so we were very carnal. My husband, uh, he drank and smoked cigarettes and rode for a support club, on motorcycles and all of this stuff, and wasn't hardly ever home at this point. I have 3 children, our son being the youngest, and I'm like going out of my mind. I'm like, who am I and what have I done? Um, and it was, as a mom, it's very easy to lose your identity. in being a mom, and you're like, that's all I'm ever going to be. I don't want to be called mom anymore. Like, I now identify as dad, until further notice, um, and so it was a struggle. And through that, I had to come to a point of surrender with God. Was like, I can't do anything else. I love my, I'm not going to fail them. And for me, I think that was the pushing momentum, was that I wanted my children to have the best opportunity. And in my head, I believed if I could keep them from going through half the stuff that I went through, then my job as a mom was success. And I knew that they would have their own stuff, their own things that they went through, but I didn't want them to go through the things that I had gone through, because they were so painful and so ugly, and just really scarred certain parts of me in my brain and my heart and my emotions. And I didn't know if I could ever truly, completely be
Mhm.
healed. And so, um, I I remember we were very distant, my husband and I, in our relationship. And then he got deathly ill, and he was being wheeled out on a gurney by the ambulance and first responders. And I remember him looking at me, holding our son, and just losing it and just bawling. And he he didn't think he was ever going to see us again. So, and he didn't have faith at that time. He kind of drifted away from it. And at that time, he, in his head, called out and he said, Jesus, if you're real, save my life. And he heard Jesus speak and tell him to come back to him, to tell me all of the lies that he was hiding from, and to restore his relationship with Christ. And so, after we left that, uh, he told me that he'd gotten into that were like, and so, okay. And the whole time, I felt that I was going to leave him and I wasn't going to believe him. And so it was keeping him from coming clean. But I was like, we all mess up. I'm not going to condemn you just because you made a mistake.
Right?
And
Like,
so, go ahead.
none of us are perfect. I
Right.
mean, I've written 2 books on it, totaling about 91,000 words so far.
Exactly. Not a single one of us is perfect. And we're not going, like, at some point in our life, we either have or let somebody down, usually more than. And
Exactly.
so I had to give him that forgiveness, because I knew the things that I had done in my past and where I was at. And it was just like, this is the first man that hasn't been on drugs and hasn't laid a hand on me, really does care. And so at that point, God did a transformation in his life. And there was a hard battle for 3 days. I mean, it was very difficult, and it required tons of prayer, a lot of hospital visits, and just like really intense focus on the situation at hand. And so, when that happened, he started leading us to church. And I was very resistant at first, just because I was like, man, I am not feeling this. I've been stuck in my ways. Like, I'm a mom, my schedule's so busy. And it just, like, I don't even know how to say that it happened. It just was like somehow God came and took us both by the hand. It was like, it's time. And so we're like, okay. And we started going, and I started learning and actually having a foundation in faith. And when I did that, um, I was able to see that there was a lack, like something that I didn't have growing up, which resulted in my situations
Hmm.
with discipleship. I didn't have anybody to teach me that there was a better way, or, how to heal from these things. And so I was like, okay, so this is what I need to teach my kids. And so we started pouring into our children. Granted, I homeschool, so I have plenty of time to do that. Um, and I want to premise with, there's a shepherd either way. So you're either being led by God or you're being led by somebody else. And usually it's not the greatest. So when we started doing that, I started getting a new perspective, and I started seeing these other kids who also were not being poured into. And God had given me this idea years ago, this really funny character called Armasum Pasadillo. It was part possum and part armadillo. And that I'd write a book about it, you know. I was like, oh, that'll be great. It'll never happen, but that's great. Well, he started showing me that this was going to be a tool to explain these biblical concepts to kids so that they could have those coping skills and that firm foundation and faith to run to him and lean on when life got really hard and started throwing these things at them, because inevitably everybody goes through stuff. Everybody has something that
Mhm.
this world has done to them, you
Exactly.
know.
And at the end of the day, we need two kinds of faith. Faith in something bigger than ourselves and faith in ourselves.
Sure.
And however you choose to get those, like, I can't knock that. It sounds like you are very comfortable in your faith and that it fuels you. It works for
Absolutely.
me. You look like a healthy, content person.
It's taken a while, but and I'm not going to say that there's like the healing process is an ever ongoing thing. Honestly, like there's things that I've healed from that every once in a while God will bring back up and be like, "Hey, so this," and I'm like, "No, I don't want to. I've already dealt with that. Deal with that." And he's like, "No, but you need to." And so, you know, that's where I have to surrender to let through it, because it's hard. You know, you go through something, just like if somebody lost a leg or an arm or something like that, there are different times, different seasons and phases of their life that requires different strength.
Exactly.
And so I believe that that's what he's doing with me through all of this. And that I started creating to sow these seeds out there as a tool for parents to show up for their kids and really just like make that room to bond, not just with each other, but bring God into the relationship, and um, kind of traverse those important faith points that need to be addressed so that these children are prepared for their future.
Right?
Because
Well,
we have to transition from child to adult to adolescent, or I guess child to teenager, adolescent to adult. And each time you do that, there is maturity that takes place. And if the parent is absent and not able to do that, then the children are trying to figure it out on their own. And that's what I saw in myself, was that I had to figure out a lot of things and it took a really long time. And so I wanted to be that middleman and just cut through all of the extra and be like, look, A to C, forget B, you know.
right? Well, and also the fact that God isn't this big scary thing that wants to punish you internally.
No.
Like,
No. See, and there's that misconception, because people want to think that the reason they're going through those things is because God is punishing them or whatever. But I had somebody ask me one time that one of the assaults I went through, she said, "Where was God in that moment?" And it stumped me for a while. It was something I really had to work on, because I was like, I know that he was there. Everything that I read in my Bible tells me that he was there, but I didn't feel him. I couldn't see him in that moment, you know? And we were talking, and she goes, as much as he was with you, praying and hoping that these things weren't happening, he was whispering in the ear of the other person, please don't do it. I love you. Don't do it. And not everybody's going to be perfect to make the right decision. And that's where, you know, our God, and we're not always going to make the right choice. But through
exactly.
I've been able to forgive the people who have hurt me in my life and move on. Not to say that I trust them completely, but I've forgiven them, and the things that they have to answer for are no longer in my hands. And I really do wish them the best, and that whatever judgment they do get, that there's mercy shown. Because as rough and horrible as my childhood and my past life, when I look at myself, I'm like, I've gone through all of these things, and I have a soft heart. I love and I care, and I have a passion for reaching these children because I want to make that difference. I want to make that change in life and in this world. And I don't know that I would have that passion if I hadn't gone through the things that I went through. I wouldn't have that momentum and that push to speak about the things that I went through, to help others heal and have hope that there are good things in your future. And if your story right now isn't good, it isn't over. It's not over. There is
Exactly.
light.
If you are still going through it, you just haven't crested the tunnel.
Right.
You will get there with time, effort, and belief.
Yes. Yes. And you have got to start taking those thoughts captive. When you have those thoughts that tell you that you don't amount to anything and that it's all your fault and all of these negative, so I intern for a life coach, and my sister does too. And there's a great story there between our healing and our getting to know each other, but that's for a different day. um, but something that we have learned about are, they're called ants, and they're automatic negative thoughts. And those ants, they're like fire ants. And so when you have those thoughts, you need to identify, where's that rooted? Where's it coming from? Because that's not what God says about me. That's not truth. And if it's not truth, you don't believe it. Just like if somebody else said, "Oh yeah, they're a clown for the carnival." No, I'm not. I work at AT&T or whatever. You're not going to believe it being
Yeah,
said.
exactly.
So why give into the negative thoughts and believe that that's true about ourselves when we know ourselves? We know our heart.
We have had just the most soulful discussion here. Thank you so much for joining me today, Janelle.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed it so much. Thanks for giving me a place to share my heart and my story.
Where can our listeners find you?
Okay, so on Facebook, you can either find me at Janell Pryor or the Unique Author. That's my author page where I release all of my books. On Instagram, it is the underscore unique dot author. Or you can go to janellpryorbooks.com, and that's my website if you want to reach out or email me or work on my team, or even look at some of the services that I offer or the merch that I offer. You can find it all there.
And as per usual, you guys can find me everywhere at Trauma to Bliss on social media and traumatobliss.ca. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode.